My banking app refreshed 3 times before the number finally settled, and even then I stared at it like it might be a glitch in the software. $0.11. 12 years of building an artisan pastry business, a decade of catering high-end weddings at 4 in the morning, every royalty check from my dessert licensing deals. All of it wiped from an account that held 6 figures the night before. I was standing inside the walk-in cooler of my commercial bakery when I saw it, my breath fogging in the frigid air, a tray of tempered chocolate shells balanced carefully on one forearm. My phone buzzed in my palm. A text message arrived from an unfamiliar number because my husband had secretly canceled our shared wireless plan sometime before dawn. It read simply, "It is over, Adelaide. I have moved on. Do not bother looking for me." Before I could even react, a formal legal notice arrived by courier at the kitchen doors, notifying me that Garrett had transferred our joint balances into an offshore account and terminated our residential lease. He genuinely believed that stripping me of every liquid dollar and leaving me on the concrete floor would force me into total submission. He had no idea that resting inside my filing cabinet was an unread convertible equity contract tied to the city's most prestigious steakhouse. Within 72 hours, his arrogant exit was going to crash headfirst into a quiet financial checkmate that would leave him completely jobless and evicted from his favorite table. My name is Adelaide Blackwood. I am 36 years old, and for 9 years I funded the rise of a man who mistook my patience for ignorance. I set the tray of tempered chocolate down very carefully because 11 years of working with delicate sugar work teaches you that panic is expensive. Shattered ganache does not reassemble itself, and neither, I was beginning to understand, does a marriage. To understand how I ended up on the floor of my own walk-in cooler with $0, you have to understand how subtle betrayal actually is. It doesn't arrive with a loud explosion. It arrives one small omission at a time, the way sugar crystallizes slowly in a copper pot you stopped watching too soon. When I married Garrett 9 years ago, he was an ambitious, charming wine sales rep working the floor of regional restaurants I was just starting to supply with custom dessert programs. Back then, I believed we were building a true partnership. My income brought in steady, reliable licensing fees from 6 different restaurant groups, plus the wholesale bakery I ran out of a leased commercial space near the Wharf District, and private weekend catering that filled every hour I wasn't already exhausted. Garrett's income as a regional distributor rep was heavily commission-based, fluctuating wildly with the seasons. So I did what I thought a supportive wife was supposed to do. I covered our mortgage, paid our health insurance premiums, and quietly transferred funds into our shared operating account whenever his commission checks came up short. I told myself that this was simply what partnership looked like in the hospitality industry. What I didn't realize was that Garrett was structuring our entire financial setup so that my independent revenue blurred directly into joint accounts, making my hard work look like shared family capital while he positioned himself as the primary provider. The subtle disrespect began small, creeping into our daily interactions like grease on a clean apron. Garrett started wearing custom-tailored suits and driving a brand-new German sedan, claiming it was necessary to maintain an image of success for high-end restaurant owners. Meanwhile, when I mentioned needing to upgrade the commercial ovens at my bakery, he dismissed me, saying I was being financially irresponsible and stressing over minor operational costs. Whenever we attended industry dinners, he loved taking credit for my success, casually introducing me to sommelier teams as his sweet little home baker while presenting himself as the strategic mastermind behind our lifestyle. The real shift began roughly 18 months ago, when Garrett secured an expanded territory that included the Obsidian Grill, a stately, dark-paneled steakhouse downtown that had been a fixture in the city's culinary scene for nearly 30 years. The restaurant was owned and actively managed by Ambrose Sutherland, a legendary chef whose reputation predated mine by decades. Garrett came home from his first meeting there practically glowing, obsessed with the old money atmosphere, the marble bar, and the prestige of the client list. He started scheduling client dinners there constantly, then taking his friends there on weekends and eventually spending 4 or 5 nights a week at their corner bar. What he never admitted was that during those endless visits, he had struck up a relationship with Piper Pemberton, a 27-year-old floor manager who had recently been promoted from hostess. Piper was sharp, ambitious, and knew exactly how to feed Garrett's fragile ego. While I was waking up at 3 in the morning to roll dough and prep 300 plated pastries for corporate luncheons, Garrett was sitting at the Obsidian Grill, ordering $300 bottles of Cabernet on corporate expense tabs, listening to Piper tell him how underappreciated he was at home. I started noticing the signs, not through dramatic discoveries, but through the heavy weight of small absences. Late nights that stretched into dawn with vague excuses about late closing clients. The faint scent of expensive floral perfume lingering on his dress shirts. Credit card receipts showing lavish midnight dinners at the Obsidian Grill on dates he claimed he was traveling out of state for wine tastings. Whenever I gently asked him about the mounting expenses or the strange schedule, Garrett turned it back on me. He claimed I was becoming cold, paranoid, and obsessed with spreadsheets, telling me that my endless hours in the kitchen had turned me into a dull, uninteresting roommate instead of a wife. The boiling point arrived 3 weeks before he emptied our bank accounts. At our annual industry showcase, where I was awarded Best Regional Pastry Artisan, Garrett took the stage to accept the plaque on my behalf while I was finishing a live demonstration in the back room. He gave a 10-minute speech thanking his own network for making my business possible, completely omitting my name from the creation of the brand. When I confronted him in the corridor afterward, he leaned against the wall, took a sip of scotch, and told me to stop being so dramatic, whispering that nobody in this city cared about the person baking the cakes. They only cared about the hands opening the wine. 3 days before that breakup text arrived, the final illusion of my marriage completely shattered. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when a routine administrative delivery arrived at my bakery. A courier handed me a certified envelope from our primary bank, addressed to our joint business entity. Inside was a formal rejection letter for an equipment loan I had never applied for. Attached to the notice was a credit audit showing that over the previous 6 months, someone had systematically altered the primary contact details on our master corporate profiles, removing my email and adding a new secondary signature authority. My blood ran cold. I locked myself in my private office, sat down at my desk, and opened my laptop. I logged directly into our master accounting system using my personal administrative credentials. For years, I had trusted Garrett when he handed me neat monthly summary folders, claiming he was keeping our books organized so I could focus on baking. I had been too exhausted, too eager to maintain peace in our home, to look beneath the surface. But that afternoon, I stopped taking his word for anything. I started with our shared operating accounts and corporate credit cards. Line by line, transaction by transaction, I cross-referenced 9 months of bank activity against my actual delivery logs and supplier invoices. The discrepancies didn't just appear. They screamed off the screen. Over $210,000 had been quietly moved out of our core reserve accounts through a series of automated weekly transfers. Garrett had routed the funds through a newly formed shell company labeled Blackwood Hospitality Logistics, an entity I had never heard of, before funneling the money directly into a private account registered under his name alone. Then I examined his corporate expense reports for his wine distribution business. Garrett had been charging thousands of dollars in luxury dinners, 5-star hotel suites, and high-end jewelry purchases directly to our joint business credit line. Over $11,000 had been spent at the Obsidian Grill alone, logged under vague promotional entertainment categories. But when I checked the actual shift schedules for those dates, the restaurant was closed for private events. Or Garrett had been marked as a solo guest seated at Piper's private table in the back lounge. He wasn't just stealing my hard-earned income to fund an affair with Piper. He was actively preparing to strip me of my entire business foundation. The loan rejection document revealed that Garrett had attempted to use my commercial bakery lease and my proprietary dessert licensing contracts as financial collateral to secure a $300,000 personal credit line. He had even uploaded a scanned copy of my signature, attempting to bypass my final authorization. The bank had flagged the application only because my tax returns didn't match the inflated revenue numbers he had listed on the forged application. I sat in the quiet office as the rain beat against the window pane, watching the numbers settle into 12 precise rows on my spreadsheet. The total magnitude of his financial deception came to over $240,000. He believed that because I was quiet, because I spent my days covered in flour and sugar, I was too foolish to understand corporate finance. He thought my kindness was weakness, and that I would simply collapse when he walked away with the money. My hands didn't shake. I didn't cry, and I didn't call him to scream. Instead, I carefully exported every single bank statement, altered signature card, and unauthorized transfer log into an encrypted folder. I printed a single physical copy of the audit summary, placed it inside my leather briefcase, and picked up my phone. I dialed David Reyes, my trusted corporate accountant who had managed my tax filings long before I ever met Garrett. When David answered, I told him calmly that I needed him to pull an old forgotten document from his vault, a contract I had signed 10 years ago with Ambrose Sutherland when I first designed the dessert menu for the Obsidian Grill. Garrett had spent months plotting to steal my present, entirely unaware that a decade-old agreement buried in a filing cabinet was about to give me total control over his future. When I left my office that afternoon, I drove straight home, expecting a difficult conversation. Instead, I walked into a psychological battlefield that Garrett had meticulously prepared. He wasn't alone. He was sitting at our dining table with his mother and his elder brother, a bottle of expensive wine open between them, acting as if they were holding an emergency family intervention. The moment I stepped through the door, Garrett didn't offer an apology or ask how my day was. He looked at me with a cold, rehearsed expression and declared that we needed to talk about my erratic behavior. He claimed that my obsessive work schedule at the bakery was destroying my mental health, making me paranoid and emotionally distant. Before I could even process his words, his mother chimed in, telling me how disappointed she was in my lack of devotion as a wife. She scoffed at my career, calling my bakery a glorified hobby that was draining Garrett's energy and ruining our chances of having a normal family. Then, Garrett set a sleek leather folder on the table. Inside was a pre-drafted legal separation agreement. He leaned forward and demanded that I sign it immediately. The terms were barbaric. I would forfeit all claims to our joint savings, surrender my administrative rights to our shared business accounts, and agree not to contact any of his corporate restaurant clients. In exchange, he offered to let me keep my commercial bakery equipment and walk away without a public scandal. When I looked him in the eye and refused to sign a single page, his calm demeanor instantly vanished. Garrett slammed his hand onto the table and launched into a venomous tirade. He leaned in close, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper, telling me that I was nothing without his charm and connections. He claimed that the regional restaurant groups only bought my dessert programs because he personally sold them on the package deal, and that if I tried to fight him, he would ensure every head chef in the state blacklisted my business. The gaslighting reached its peak when Piper's name was brought up. When I confronted him about the $11,000 in unauthorized charges at the Obsidian Grill, Garrett didn't even flinch. He laughed in my face, claiming that Piper was a brilliant corporate strategist who actually understood his vision. Unlike a cold spreadsheets-obsessed baker like me, he told me that I had driven him into her arms because I had turned our home into a silent, loveless office. His brother nodded in agreement, muttering that I should be grateful Garrett was offering me any settlement at all after neglecting my marriage for years. They spent 2 hours trying to wear me down, using every emotional trick in the book. They threatened to leak edited financial records to my commercial landlord to get my bakery lease revoked, and claimed they would tell our mutual friends that I had abandoned the marriage due to severe emotional breakdown. They genuinely believed that by surrounding me with family pressure and attacking my self-esteem, they could force me to surrender my rights without reading the fine print. I sat there quietly, listening to every threat, taking mental notes of every insult. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't cry, and I didn't give them the emotional reaction they were desperately fishing for. I simply reached across the table, closed the leather folder, and placed it inside my satchel. As I stood up to leave, Garrett followed me into the hallway, shouting that I was making a catastrophic mistake and that I would be begging him for money within a week. He was convinced he had cornered me, completely unaware that his arrogance had pushed me straight into the office of the one man who held the key to his absolute destruction. The next morning, I met my accountant, David Reyes, at a small diner 2 blocks from my bakery. David had spent the previous evening digging through the archive vaults, and on the table between us sat a faded yellow folder containing a contract signed 10 years ago. Before I married Garrett, when I was a struggling young pastry chef working 80 hours a week, Ambrose Sutherland had brought me in to overhaul the failing dessert menu at the Obsidian Grill. In exchange for my custom recipes and low consulting fees, my lawyer had insisted on a protective clause, a convertible equity option, granting me a 5% stake in the restaurant that would instantly convert to voting stock if ownership or management control were ever threatened by outside forces. While David was explaining the legal force of the clause, my phone rang. It was Ambrose himself, his voice sounding tired and weathered, asking if I could meet him privately in the upstairs dining room of the Obsidian Grill before service. When I arrived, the legendary 72-year-old chef was sitting alone at a long mahogany table, surrounded by stacks of financial records and corporate correspondence. Ambrose looked every year of his age. He confessed to me that recent health struggles had forced him to consider selling a controlling interest in the restaurant to Halcyon Hospitality Group, a massive corporate conglomerate. But then he slid a printed stack of emails across the table toward me, messages exchanged between Garrett and Halcyon's acquisition team. My stomach churned as I read through the pages. Garrett had been secretly acting as a paid consultant for Halcyon behind Ambrose's back. He had promised to manipulate Ambrose into selling the steakhouse below market value, boasting in one email that he could easily convince the old man to step down. Even worse, Garrett had assured the corporate buyers that once the acquisition was complete, my original dessert contract and my hidden equity option would be quietly erased, writing callously that his wife trusted him blindly and would never read the revised paperwork. Garrett hadn't just stolen my savings. He had spent 18 months orchestrating a scheme to strip me of an asset he didn't even understand, using his position as a wine rep to sabotage both my career and Ambrose's 40-year legacy. Ambrose looked up at me with tears of quiet rage in his eyes, telling me that he trusted the woman who had helped build his culinary reputation far more than the slick salesman who had tried to sell his life's work out from under him. David Reyes stepped into the room with our legal team. We laid out the strategy. By triggering my 10-year-old conversion clause, my 5% converted into an active voting stake, giving me the legal power as a minority partner to block any sale to Halcyon Hospitality. Recognizing the threat, Ambrose immediately signed a new partnership agreement, granting me executive authority over vendor operations and corporate contracts, including the restaurant's exclusive wine distribution agreements. Furthermore, Corinne, the restaurant's veteran general manager, brought us the internal audit logs revealing that Piper had been approving thousands of dollars in unauthorized comped meals and expensive wine for Garrett under fake marketing categories. In a single morning, the trap Garrett thought he had set for me collapsed entirely onto him. I held the voting rights, I held the vendor contracts, and I had the full backing of a culinary legend. The stage was officially set for the final showdown. If your own spouse drained your life savings, cheated on you, and tried to sell your career out from under you, would you quietly let the lawyers handle it, or would you confront them in public right when they think they have won? By Thursday evening, exactly 72 hours after I sat on the cold floor of my walk-in cooler with $0 to my name, I walked into the Obsidian Grill. I wasn't there as a quiet, heartbroken wife begging for answers. I walked in as a managing partner, exercising my full legal authority over the establishment. Garrett was seated at his favorite corner booth in the back dining room, the one with soft velvet seats and dim lighting that he had reserved for months. Piper was standing right beside him in her black floor manager's blazer, laughing softly as he poured wine from an open bottle of high-end vintage Cabernet that belonged to his distribution line. They were celebrating, completely convinced that I had been beaten, evicted, and silenced. I didn't scream, and I didn't raise my voice to create a public spectacle. I walked straight up to their table with Corinne, our general manager, and my corporate attorney standing right behind me. The ambient chatter of the surrounding tables faded into the background as I set a thick leather folder directly onto the white tablecloth between their wine glasses. Garrett looked up, his face instantly twisting into a mixture of annoyance and smug condescension. He leaned back in his chair, scoffed, and asked me what I thought I was doing, warning me in a harsh whisper that I was embarrassing myself in front of high-profile clients. He told me to take my drama outside before he had security escort me from the building. I looked him dead in the eye and told him calmly that he no longer had the authority to order anyone around in this building. I opened the folder and pointed to the first document, the legally executed equity conversion agreement that established my active voting stake and managing partnership in the Obsidian Grill. Before his brain could fully process what he was reading, I slid the second document across the table toward Piper. It was an immediate notice of termination for gross corporate fraud and unauthorized misuse of company expense accounts, detailing the $11,000 in comped meals and wine she had illegally wiped from his tab. Piper's face turned deathly pale. Her hands trembled as she picked up the sheet, her eyes darting across the signatures at the bottom. She stammered that I couldn't fire her, claiming that Ambrose would never allow such a thing. Corinne stepped forward and quietly informed her that Ambrose had personally signed the termination order 2 hours earlier, along with a formal criminal referral to the District Attorney's Financial Crimes Division. Garrett stood up so fast his chair screeched against the hardwood floor. The smug smirk was completely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He reached out to grab my arm, trying to lower his voice as he stuttered that we could talk about the money privately, claiming he was planning to return the drained funds all along. I stepped back, looked at him with cold detachment, and handed him the final notice. As a managing partner with executive authority over vendor operations, I officially terminated his company's wine distribution agreement with the Obsidian Grill, effective immediately, pending a full forensic audit of every bottle he had delivered over the last 2 years. Piper looked at Garrett in complete horror, realizing in a single second that his promises of wealth and executive influence were built on stolen money and forged contracts. She didn't say a word to defend him. She grabbed her purse, dropped her manager badge on the table, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving him standing alone in front of a room full of staring guests. Garrett stood there, penniless, stripped of his biggest account, facing career destruction and legal prosecution, realizing too late that the quiet woman he had spent 9 years underestimating held the deed to his entire world. The weeks that followed unfolded with the clean, undeniable precision of facts finally allowed to move freely. Halcyon Hospitality Group immediately withdrew their acquisition offer once their corporate legal team reviewed our unanimous consent partnership agreement, effectively protecting Ambrose's legacy from a hostile takeover. Garrett's employer, informed of the ongoing forensic audit into the comped wine inventory and his conflict of interest, terminated his employment for cause, blacklisting him from major wine distribution firms across the region. Piper faced formal misdemeanor charges for expense fraud, which completely ruined her reputation in the tight-knit local hospitality industry. My divorce from Garrett was finalized 4 months later. The court ordered him to return every cent of the $210,000 he had secretly transferred out of our joint accounts after my legal team demonstrated a clear pattern of premeditated financial concealment. It wasn't just about getting the money back. It was about reclaiming my dignity and establishing that my years of hard work were never his to spend. Today, Ambrose and I still meet every Tuesday morning in that same small upstairs dining room over fresh espresso and hot pastries. He often chuckles with his dry, seasoned humor, telling me that Garrett accidentally accomplished something no one else could in a decade. He forced an old chef to dust off a 10-year-old contract and secure the future of his restaurant. I still run my commercial bakery, but I also actively oversee the entire culinary and vendor operations at the Obsidian Grill as a managing partner. Sometimes, during a busy dinner service, I sit at that same back corner booth where Garrett used to plot my downfall. I don't sit there out of bitterness or nostalgia, but because it has the clearest view of the kitchen pass. I like watching my signature desserts leave the line exactly as I designed them, unbothered, elegant, and entirely my own. I used to believe that the worst thing that could happen to a woman was losing everything she had built alongside the person she loved. I understand now that the true tragedy would have been living my entire life without knowing my actual worth, waiting for someone else to grant me permission to succeed. If someone you love ever mistakes your silence for ignorance or assumes that your kindness means you'll never read the fine print, remember this: those who underestimate what you are worth are usually the ones standing closest to the paperwork that proves them wrong.